the Neonatal Research Network. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Christy Waterberg, who's with us from the University of New Mexico Health Science Center. She is a professor emerita pediatrics in the Division of Neonatology. She was a former division chief there from 2006 to 2011, and she's been the PI of NICHD's National Research Network since 2006. Again, another wonderful demonstration of prolonged networks that have been funded by NICHD, and that we're happy to be part of the wave of this with Imprint now. So I'd like to have Dr. Waterberg address the National Research Network, the work that they've done, and future interactions that we can have with the Neonatal Network. Dr. Waterberg?
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me to present this afternoon. This is a 5-minute overview of the network, and it was established in parallel with the maternal fetal medicine networks. Next slide, please. So we were established in 1986, so we are now 36 years old. We've done more than 60 studies, have over 450 publications, and 35 of those were in the top tier journals. The mission is to investigate the safety and efficacy of treatment and management strategies to care for newborns, particularly extremely low birth weight infants. Our specific aims are to identify priority areas for research, to perform observational and interventional studies, and to evaluate those interventions, including efficacy, safety, and cost effectiveness. Next slide, please. These are the current NRN centers, and it goes through 2023. So we are all busily preparing our applications for the recompetition, and it'll be in parallel with the MFMU. So the applications are due in August. Next slide, please. So I just want to highlight some of the key contributions of the Neonatal Research Network over time, and that falls under three trial areas. One is continuing observation of populations, treatments, outcomes, and trends over time. So we now have data on over 91,000 extremely preterm infants going from 1986 to current. And we have published a series of papers about the effects of the treatments on those babies in JAMA, most recently this year. Secondly, are trials that are, quote, negative studies or stopped for futility or adverse events. But these trials have gone on to influence practice and subsequent trial design. As examples, people were using intravenous immunoglobulin for nosocomial sepsis, and the trial that the network did some time back showed that that was useless. So nobody does that anymore. Putting glutamine and TPN to see if the nutritional addition would help, which it did not, and inhaled nitric oxide for preterm infants. We have tried to do hydrocortisone studies for blood pressure in both term and preterm infants, and had to stop enrollment in both of those groups because due to the nature of the problem, the window for enrolling babies is like 30 seconds, and we were unable to enroll substantial numbers of babies in those studies. Inositol for retinopathy of prematurity was a long process, including pharmacokinetics and modeling and all that, and it ended up being terminated early for an unexpected adverse event. Same with optimizing cooling. On the other hand, there are landmark trials that have changed neonatal care because of the findings of the trials, including the first major study of whole body cooling for hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. The support study, which showed that CPAP was equally as valuable as early intubation for preterm babies with respiratory distress. And the support study also studied oxygen targeting. Oxygen saturation targeting had been dropping for several years, thinking that you didn't want to have retinopathy of prematurity from having too high of the saturation targeting. However, this showed that lower saturations were also associated with adverse outcomes. And then a landmark trial of inhaled nitric oxide for hypoxic respiratory failure and pulmonary hypertension in term infants. And in addition to those studies, there are unique resources, biomarkers, including MRIs and genomics and that kind of a resource, but particularly high quality data, including follow-up. We've had an interest. Next slide, please. We've collaborated with other NIH institutes, including NHLBI and NEI and others. Other government agencies, for example, we've partnered with the CDC looking at the incidence of early onset sepsis and the pathologic mechanisms. We've partnered with private industry, including Abbott Labs and Massimo. And new to us is an open network. We've started encouraging non-member institutions to apply to participate in specific network studies. Next slide. Special strengths of the network are a consistent infrastructure that enables longer-term follow-up. We're doing school-age follow-up. We started that with the whole body cooling trial. We've done it with a cohort of babies enrolled in the support trial who had MRIs, looking at their school-age outcomes. And we're now in the process of doing that for hydrocortisone study for BPD and the transfusion of preterms trials. One of the real strengths is that we have this established framework and certified examiners, which allows completion of studies over many years. The necrotizing enterocolitis laparotomy versus drain study for neurodevelopmental outcomes took 7 years to enroll, but importantly documented a critical difference between a preoperative diagnosis of necrotizing enterocolitis versus a diagnosis of GI perforation in the association of laparotomy with outcomes. The late hypothermia trial recruited babies over 6 years by the time we got our sample size at the end. And the hydrocortisone for BPD trial took 6.5 years to enroll patients. So the idea of having a long-term established network, including data collection over more than 30 years, has enabled assessment of long-term changes. So as you might expect with tiny babies, there is a very difficult process of getting biospecimens for blood in particular. And so we do not probably have nearly as much of those in the biorepositories as the other people who've been talking today. But we do have a lot of data and imaging studies, as well as some biospecimens in a repository. Next slide. So examples of need in neonatology is pretty much everything still. As you were talking about, there is not a great deal of inclusion of tiny babies or even term babies in studies, as well as pregnant women and lactating women. We need studies of neuroprotection. We have just finished doing a study of Darby Poet, in which we don't have the results for yet. Clearly, we need more information on nutrition. We have a study of using donor milk versus formula supplementation in extremely preterm infants, which should be coming out relatively soon. We need more on drugs and devices, obviously. The long-term outcomes, we're hoping to have some better outcomes. We're looking at the hydrocortisone kids in relationship to lung function at 6 years. And we're comparing those to a spectrum of preterm babies in the transfusion study, long-term pulmonary outcomes. And then we're comparing that to a set of term infants who had no diseases to get the first really good handle on the differences in pulmonary functions on those babies long-term. We do need new biomarkers. We need to be able to know some of the outcomes of our studies before waiting for 5 or 6 years. And the personalized medicine, the pharmacogenomics, needs to be applied to the small preterm babies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Waterberg. Are there any questions? I've been looking here in the chat. I haven't seen one yet, but if you do have a question for Dr. Waterberg about the Neonatal Research Network, please speak up.
I have a quick question. This is Sarah Van Dries at Vanderbilt. So you mentioned you don't have a lot of biospecimens from the infants because it is hard to collect, but you do have long-term follow-up. Have studies gone back and gotten DNA from kids when they're a little bit older and it's a little easier to obtain, and then analyze the data post hoc with the genetic information added?
We do have a study of genomics, and I think that was from back on the glutamine study and looking at single nucleotide SNPs and outcomes, and they have reported a couple of studies from there. In terms of getting DNA, the other closest that we've come is a study that we did in 6-year-olds, looking at buccal smears and DNA from that to see if, particularly to look at the methylation and whether the difference in methylation was associated with differences in outcomes. But aside from that, I don't think that we have done that yet.
It sounds like it's technically possible to recontact and to reach out and to ask folks to provide a sample in it for a new study if that were a desire of the investigators.
I would say variably. It depends on the permissions that were obtained at the time. And we are now, putting all of our stuff into Dash. So we should have more availability of that in the future.
Thanks.
And Dr. Waterberg, along those same lines, is there any information longitudinally about, other diseases, autoinflammatory, vasculitides, anything else that these children develop where someone could go back into neonatal specimens and data? Just wondering what the longitudinal follow-up has been in some of these patients.
The longitudinal follow-up has been, like I said, limited in pretty much to 2 years, and now we're doing 6 or 7 year follow-up on some of those kids. So I'm not sure that we have the information, for instance, that Saroj Segal does in the Canadian group of kids who now are adults and looking at what their outcomes are. And some of the Europeans in the Netherlands, for example. Stephanie's putting something in there.
So in
saying
terms of
that-
the limitation of being able to collect samples as well.
Yes, it would skew the outcome data if you can't get specimens from the kids that didn't survive. So you don't know what the questions you could evaluate in that way.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate your help. So if there's no other questions for Dr. Waterberg, we're going to move on to Dr. Joe Manetsky. He